I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce, and this is The Radical Center, a recording project I began in 2022 as a way to describe and discuss the social and ideological currents that are rapidly altering our culture. In a time when political polarization seems to be the norm, I'm seeking to understand rather than react. I'm grateful to all the thoughtful men and women who share their stories and insights with me in this conversation series. If you would like to contribute to this project financially, there are links in the description. Thank you, and thank you all for listening and being part of this exploration. Right, today I'm speaking with Alex Schadenberg. And Alex, you are the Executive Director for the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition in
Correct,
Ontario,
yep.
Right?
Yeah, I'm in Canada, in Ontario, Canada, but my work goes beyond Canada. We started obviously in Canada, but I've been heavily involved in the assisted suicide issue in the US as well as Europe and other places. I've been battling the whole euthanasia issue in those places also. So.
Well, yeah, you and I were just speaking right before we hit record, and you were mentioning that, we do have assisted suicide here in Washington State where I live. I know it was really,
Correct.
It was a big, I guess it was in the news quite a bit when it was approved in Oregon some years ago. Might be even like 20 years ago. It was a while back now, but
a little over 20 years, yeah.
Okay. And I listened recently to a conversation you had with Jonathan Van Maren, and I've spoken with Jonathan before. If people are interested in that conversation, you can find a link in my archives. But I was listening to this conversation that you were having, and it was I find it really alarming and scary, what's happening with euthanasia and how the end of life is being medicalized. And some of the issues you raised were just really, really deeply disturbing.
Well, I think I'll give you a quick overture because most of your viewers will probably be American. And so when we're talking about assisted suicide or euthanasia, you have assisted suicide in Washington State. It's been legal there since you had a voter initiative, a plebiscite, right, in 2008 that passed. And so the law came into place in 2009 in Washington State. But we have euthanasia in Canada, and the two are very similar. There's not much difference between the two. Euthanasia is when the doctor or nurse practitioner would actually do it to you. They inject you, or they put it into a line so that it goes into you. But the fact of it is, it's done by the doctor or the nurse, and it's they poison you to death. Essentially, is what you could say. I don't want to get too much into how it's done. I could get into that a little bit because it is a little bit controversial how it's done. But anyway, Washington State has assisted suicide. So the difference is not the drugs. The drugs are very similar. The difference is not the intention. The intention is for the person to die. The difference is how it's done. So assisted suicide, the doctor would prescribe, or I think you have nurse practitioners now in Washington State that can do so. They would then be involved in prescribing the lethal poisons, and the person has to take it themselves. So you see the difference between assisted suicide and euthanasia is how it's carried out. In assisted suicide, technically you have to do it yourself, whereas with euthanasia, the doctor or nurse does it to you. That also changes its definition because euthanasia, how we legalize euthanasia in Canada is we created an exception to homicide in our criminal code. So if you look at Canada's criminal code, they didn't actually change the main part of it. I'm not allowed to kill you in Canada, but if two doctors or two nurse practitioners or one of each agree that your request to be killed is accepted, then they can go ahead and kill you. So that's an exception to homicide. So it's a very interesting thing. The law actually, so when they say to me, "Oh, Alex," when I call it killing, and the other people say, "Oh, it's not killing, Alex, it's medical aid in dying." Okay, well, what is medical aid in dying? I say, well, actually, no. Look at the criminal code. The criminal code recognizes in Canada that it is an exception to homicide. It is homicide, okay? And in the U.S., you have assisted suicide laws. So in Washington State, it's an exception to assisting a suicide. If someone were not a physician or not a nurse practitioner in Washington State, they would not be able to assist your suicide, whereas if they are, they can. That's how it basically works. The problem with all of this stuff is that it's sold to us as a lie. And I get this to the very beginning. I'm going to hit this thing right off the top. People say, well, what about suffering? What about, and I say, yeah, I agree with you. I don't want people to suffer. I've got no interest in you suffering. I would rather you be given proper care. The concept of people not being properly cared for upsets me greatly. But to actually give your doctor or your nurse practitioner the right and law to be involved with killing you is a whole nother question. Okay. So they say it's all about choice and freedom and autonomy. But when you actually look at the law, if you actually look at the Washington state statute or the Canadian law or the Oregon statute, you realize what they've actually done is they've given total anonymity, total freedom to a physician to be involved with causing your death. So let me explain that. They use what you call the good faith principle. So let's say, as a sad example, somebody who you knew very well died by assisted suicide, and you just thought it just didn't make sense. This didn't make sense. Something wrong has happened here, and you were to file a complaint. All they would do if they decide to investigate, they would have to approach the physician who was involved with the act, and the physician would say, well, I was of the opinion that this person fit the criteria of the law based on good faith. I did so. Therefore, and you're right, you couldn't prosecute them. It wouldn't be possible. So it's given them complete and total freedom to cause people's death. And that to me is very concerning. I don't think any law should give somebody else the right and law to kill you. I don't think that's a good idea.
It's an awful lot of power to put into a medical authority. And I think it has to rest on an assumption that medical authorities are rather saintly figures who couldn't have any other incentive but the very best possible wishes for the patient, which we just know that that's not true.
We know that's not true. In fact, it's interesting. A Euthanasia Prevention Coalition was founded by a doctor and a nurse practitioner here in Canada and myself many, many, many years ago, when I was much younger and had nice hair, not gray hair, etc. And the nurse practitioner, she was a palliative care specialist. She was well known in Canada as she had won awards for her palliative care specialty that she had been doing all the years. She was a great, great, great woman. And she would always say, well, I don't trust every doctor I work with. So the concept of giving a doctor the right and law to be involved with killing someone put shivers down my spine. That's how she would talk, because she was right. And if you start thinking about this recent research, someone should look this up, because this research just came out by Christopher Lyon. Christopher Lyon is a man who teaches in the UK, but his father died by euthanasia here in Canada, in Victoria, BC. And he was very upset with the circumstances of that death. To him, it just didn't make sense. To him, it was absolutely wrong what had happened to his father. So he did not come from this from a point of view that he was opposed to the concept of euthanasia. He came to this from the point of view as he was opposed to what happened to his father. But that opened the door. Like, once he started doing research, he realized that the law was very, very horrific. On top of it, we have things in Canada going on with euthanasia for people with mental illness, euthanasia for people who are living in poverty, euthanasia for people with disabilities, euthanasia for people who are homeless. All of this is going on in Canada. And so he recently published this article about the whole thing about healthcare serial killers. That excellent article. So what he's done all this research into what we would consider basic historical knowledge into healthcare serial killers and why they get away with what they get away with. So there's been quite a few of them, actually. It's sort of a bit shocking. We don't want to talk that way. We like to think of our doctor as this caring person who's going to take care of us in our time of need. And most of them actually are caregivers. Absolutely. Most of them are actually concerned with your health, and they do their job correctly, and etc. But there are a few out there who like the power over killing. And if you start Googling it, you realize that there's been quite a few. And so he writes about that and all the signs of a healthcare serial killer, that they, with the deep research into what was the commonality between these people, etc. And then he starts talking about certain euthanasia doctors in Canada. And he's saying, I'm not calling them healthcare serial killers, but if you look at the data here, if you look at the information and the research, it should make you concerned. And this is the kind of thing. Now, you would have the same thing in the U.S. You've had quite a few over the years, healthcare serial killers in the U.S. And most of them got away with it for a very long time. before they finally got arrested. And you start going through these cases and you start saying, well, how did they get away with it? How did this go on for so long? They'd have these high death rates amongst their patients. And you'd say to yourself, well, didn't they recognize something? There was always, and sadly, there was almost always a cover up, which let them go on and on and on for years. We had a case recently here in Canada of a nurse, and she had killed people in nursing homes. And they would just let her go because there would be this high death rate and there'd be some complaints against her. And then they would let her go because she was a nurse. She just get hired by the next place. And the only reason they found out about it was because she was going to a psychiatrist. And she told the psychiatrist what she had been doing. Now there's a relationship between psychiatry and their patients. So the psychiatrist called the police and said, I can't tell you what I've been told based on my commitment to my patient, but I can tell you if you investigate this nursing home and this nursing home and that nursing home and the suspicious deaths, I think you're going to find something. Wow. And sure enough, she ended up being convicted for 8 deaths, but she might have done many more.
Yeah.
But it's only because she went to a psychiatrist and told the psychiatrist what she had been doing. That's the only reason it came out.
Mm-hmm. When you mentioned nursing homes, and that's truly terrifying, and it speaks to the idea that there's a lot of individual variation. There's bad actors in the medical field as well as any other field. So to give that much power to just one field. They're human
beings. That's exactly it, Leslie.
Exactly.
Right.
And when you talk about nursing homes, I guess when I first started thinking about this euthanasia movement and seeing it get so much press in Canada, the MAID movement, I thought back to an incident that happened in 2014. My ex-husband's grandmother was being cared for in an assisted living center, and her primary point of contact and caregiver was still her daughter. So her daughter was going there almost every day and was coordinating her care. And she really didn't need very much care because she was very high functioning. So it helped her to live in that context, but she wasn't requiring nursing care. Well, her daughter, my ex-husband's mom, died suddenly, and she was left bereft, and she very quickly deteriorated. The grief was really hard for her, and she went into some dementia, which, it was questionable whether that was a transient thing due to the grief and was going to resolve, or whether this was just the end of her life and this was her trajectory. But either way, she was put into nursing care, and we got report after report of how poor this nursing care was. And she was crying and complaining, and she was really miserable when family would come to visit her, and we lived far away. And I kind of, at the time, I wished we could have taken her in, but it wasn't something that seemed reasonable to my husband at the time, et cetera. That's a long story. But the family that lived there would say she would complain bitterly about how she was being treated, and she would have bruises, and she would look like she was not being taken care of. And yet the decision was made to keep her there. And it felt like the feeling to me was like, she's almost dead anyway. These last months or days don't matter that much. And so there was this sense that this part of her life mattered less than other parts of her life. And when I start to think about euthanasia, it's like, who's making the decision that after a certain point, your life is meaningless? We can decide for you that now. And where do you decide that? Is it based on poverty, mental illness, like you said? Is it based on you're no longer childbearing? You're not responsible for kids anymore? Where do we cut people off?
Okay, so right off the bat, these situations in nursing homes, like obviously nursing homes are like any other place, and they vary greatly. Some of them are quite good. Some of them have caring staff. Some of them are not very good. And every place that you'll find also, the other situation is that every place, every institution develops a sort of culture around it. So you might go into one place and you're visiting someone, and everyone seems quite, nice, and they're kind to each other, and they talk positive. And the next place you're thinking, oh, I would want to live there. It's a culture that develops, that somebody in charge or something's going on, and it's not very good. And this is the kind of thing that happens. But in Canada with our euthanasia law, the problem has been that there's been people who are saying, I don't want to live like this. And so then they ask for euthanasia. So it's the lack of care that leads them then to ask for euthanasia. So I'm going to give a little difference between Canada and Washington State, for instance. So when we legalized euthanasia in Canada in 2016, the law originally required you to have a type of a terminal condition. It was never really defined. So it was like a mess from the beginning. But they said that your natural death had to be reasonably foreseeable, which, but in Washington State, at least they have a definition. It's called 6 months. You have to have a 6 month prognosis for being approved for assisted suicide. That's a problem also because what does it mean to have a 6 month prognosis? A lot of people think, oh, well, they must be end stage cancer, or that's not true. If you actually look at how they define it in Washington State, if you have a medical condition that if you were to say no to treatment could result in you dying within 6 months, then you would qualify. So, for instance, if you are a diabetic, I mean, an insulin dependent diabetic, and you were becoming very depressed and suicidal, and you were to say, I'm going to stop taking insulin, then you would qualify for assisted suicide because if you're insulin dependent and you don't take insulin, you're going to be dead within 6 months for sure. Okay. Wow. So obviously speaking, these are the kind of things that we have to understand how these laws work. Nonetheless, getting back to Canada, we've had quite a few cases of people who had asked for euthanasia because of homelessness, or they had, let's say, people with MCS. We've had this sad situation of people with multiple chemical sensitivities. So here's the problem with having multiple chemical sensitivities. A lot of people who have MCS, they're reacting to things in their environment, and these things vary, obviously, but a lot of these people find themselves on disability because they can't work, right? It's hard to go out into a work environment if you're constantly reacting to whether it be certain cleaning fluids or whatever it might be. And if you've got an extreme case of chemical sensitivities, because let's be honest, we all sort of have some level of chemical sensitivity. Every single one of us do. But I mean, if it's an extreme situation for you, then it becomes a debilitating factor for you. If you can't work, then often you end up where? You end up in social housing. So this is the problem we've had in Canada. These people with MCS, multiple chemical sensitivities, who are living in social housing, who are then asking for euthanasia. And why? They say, I can't go out. Now, imagine living in social housing, because if you're living in social housing, you're living with a lot of people who are living in near poverty, and there's going to be a lot of factors around that, whether that be someone next door is cleaning fluid, whether that be whatever. We're not talking about expensive, well-built buildings, okay? We're talking about lower class buildings that, are being kept going because it gives certain people a place to live. It's a very big problem for people with MCS, and we've had several of these people die by euthanasia. And you would say, well, wait a second here. Isn't there a treatment for MCS? And the answer is absolutely there is. They just need a clean place to live. They need to have an house and a clean place to live, and then they'll function just fine. Now, it depends to what degree their MCS is, but they'll still function fine. But instead, they're dying by euthanasia. So you can see how these whole factors come. We had, during COVID, there were several people, and there was several stories that came out of people who died by euthanasia. And the reason is that they said, I can't handle being locked in they were in a nursing home, for instance. I can't handle being locked into this nursing home any longer. So they applied for euthanasia and were approved for euthanasia, not because they were dying or nearing death. It's because they said, I can't live like this any longer. So it shows you, then they say, oh, but this, Alex, it's all about choice and freedom and autonomy. Well, first of all, as I say, look at the laws. It's not. It is about the doctor or nurse practitioner making a decision that you have to request it. But there's many reasons you might request it. There's many reasons why you might be going through a difficult time in your life and thinking your life lacks meaning, purpose, or value. But it's the doctor or nurse practitioner who makes the decision. They're the ones who approve your death, and they're the ones who carry it out. What even makes this even crazier, whether you're in Washington State or Canada or Oregon or wherever, it doesn't matter. The laws are all designed with a self-reporting system. So none of these places have what you call a pre-approval system, meaning every jurisdiction is just a doctor or a nurse practitioner, and you need two. One to examine you and to sign off, saying, yes, I agree, this person fits the criteria of the law. And the second one is basically just signing off that the first one got it right, okay? So whether it's Canada or Washington State, that's how it works. But there's no committee. Now think about this. We're talking about your life and death, okay? So you could have a pretty pro-death person doing your assessment, and there could be lots of alternatives for you, but they're deciding that, oh yes, I agree, they want to die. We're going to give them these poisons to have them cause their death, to have them die, and then on top of it, then the reporting system. So you might have heard between our conversation, because you're listening to Jonathan and I doing the interview with each other. The data that we get, whether it be Washington State, Oregon, or Canada, is questionable. Let me give you. So what happens is the doctor who prescribes the lethal poison to you in Washington State is the same doctor who's required by law to send in a report. The doctor's actually rarely at the death.
Mm.
So they're sending in a report. So they prescribed you, they approved your death. They prescribed you the lethal poison. You die. They send in the report. So you have a self-reporting system. You don't even have a third party, someone who's totally outside of the decision, who's looking over all the medical records first and then putting together a report. You don't even have that. So it's really a controlled system. So let me give you an example. So in Oregon last year, there was 367 reported assisted suicide deaths in the state of Oregon last year. And they say, oh, but there was only 10 reports where they show that there was problems with the death. Okay, I mean, there might have been someone who they threw up, or there might have been other factors. It didn't work out well for them. So, but if you actually read the report, it shows you that there was only 102 times out of the 367 that the doctor was actually at the death. And it's only when the doctor's at the death when they fill out that report as to there being problems or not. And so therefore you actually had 10 out of 102. So it's actually about 10%.
10%.
It's about 10%. And the year before, it was 9%. So that means in 2022 in Oregon. Now, in Washington State, they don't even fill out that. There isn't even a report like that. There just doesn't exist. So when you're looking at the data, it's actually about 10% failure rate or problem rate, okay? And so we're talking about quote, quote, death with dignity, and we know 10% of the time, it's not going to go very well for you. The other thing is that the length of death. So the Oregon report showed last year there was about 115 hours with the longest death last year in Oregon. 115 hours. So could you imagine you're sitting there beside your grandmother who took the lethal poison, and it takes 115 hours for her to die?
Wow.
That doesn't sound like a death with dignity to me. That just doesn't sound like it. A lot of this people just don't understand. The final thing that really should upset people is actually how the drugs work. So we have to explain to people the drug cocktails, first of all, are not, the drugs they're using are of course not assigned for assisted suicide. What's happened is that around 2015, the assisted suicide lobby in the US decided they wanted a cheaper way to do assisted suicide. So what they did is a bunch of these doctors who do assisted suicide got together and they created a concoction for assisted suicide. And as they, if you read the reports on it, they say, oh, well, we knew this was going to kill them. The question was just how effective it was going to be. This is the kind of thing they're talking about. Imagine you've been approved for assisted suicide, and now you're also part of a lethal experiment.
Wow.
And some of these deaths didn't go well at all. Some of these deaths, people were screaming in pain because it was burning their throat. The drug content was just burning their throat, etc. When they were screaming in pain. Of course, some of these deaths took a very long time. Last year, as I say, was the record, 115 hours in Oregon. But this is how they came up with the drug cocktail. So then they did that. And then after so many deaths, they realized, oh, well, this isn't working out very well. Death with dignity, my body, my choice, but we're causing these people to suffer incredibly. So I think we better change our drug concoction. And so they did that and they did that. And so now they're, I think, on the 5th drug concoction now. And this is how they do it. So what they have to do, just so you know, the concoction they use to kill you is very harsh, very harsh. And if you go to the assisted suicide doctors have their own website. If you go to that website, you'll see a lot of commentary about the use of these drugs and is this really ethical to do it this way? And these kind of discussions they're having. And of course, the answer is yes, because it's effective. It causes death. So these people are asking for death. We're causing death. This is effective. Well, what it does is you need to use a 3 sort of mixture of a concoction. You need to put these people into coma. Now, why do you need to do that? They have to be sleeping in coma because the drug mixture that's going to cause their death is very harsh. It burns your throat. It's very horrible. So they have to have part of that drug mixture, something to put you into coma, because then it looks nice because you're sleeping. They look at first like, they weren't enjoying this at first, but you see, they get enough drug to kill an elephant. I mean, to put an elephant in a coma. So obviously speaking, they're going to be sleeping for a long time. Second thing is to go into paralysis. Now, why did they have to do that? Well, if you look at the old Dutch research, and it's important, in the Netherlands, they were the first ones to legalize euthanasia, right, in the world. And there was a lot of reports from 20 years ago of the problem with euthanasia, and they had said they had about a 17% failure rate. One of the things that happened is people went into convulsions. Could you imagine you're sitting beside your grandmother's bed as she's dying, and she goes into convulsions? And then we call this a death with dignity. It didn't make people very happy. So they give you another mixture, which puts you into so you can't go into convulsion. So it puts you actually into paralysis. So they've given you drugs for what? Coma, paralysis. The drug to kill you, actually, people think it shuts down their heart, but it doesn't actually work that way. The drugs they use actually shut down your lungs. So what happens is the lungs stop working. Okay? What happens to your lungs when they can't go breathing like that? What happens is your lungs fill with fluid.
So you drown.
Right? You die of drowning is actually how you die. And then you hear the assisted suicide doctors saying, oh, well, my patients, they look so serene when they die. Yeah, you put them in coma.
Because they're paralyzed.
And you paralyze them. So, of course, they're going to look like that. But let's be brutally honest. Nobody wants to die by drowning. Now, the other thing is, because it works that way, sometimes, depending on the health of your body, let's say you actually had quite healthy lungs, you might live 115 hours before you die. As bad as that is. So what happens, of course, as you know, the lungs stop working, then the heart will also stop beating because the oxygen isn't generating through your body, etc. Yeah. The heart will stop, and you do die that way. But this is how it works. People don't think about that. They're thinking, oh, it's a death. It goes quick and easy. Well, some of these deaths are not quick. Most of them are not easy.
Yeah.
And the fact of it is that when you're put in coma and you're put in paralysis, yes, it might look nice, but, I'm not assuming that you're, even in coma, I'm not assuming that you're not experiencing suffering.
Yeah.
You just can't show us that you are. And if you really question that, you ask someone who's gone through, like there's people who've gone through surgeries who were not put in deep enough, right? And they talk about how horrific the experience was. Now, most of the anesthesiologists are pretty good. They know how to put you deep into coma, etc., in order to do surgery. But sometimes it's not perfect, right? And you hear these stories. Well, you can't assume that this is a beautiful death. You can't assume that because they can't communicate with you.
No, they make it pretty on the outside for sure, but we don't really know what that experience is like for the dying person.
That's exactly it. Now, for me, people come to opposition to this for many reasons. For me, I'm opposed to killing people. So, in a sense, right off the bat, you would say, yeah, well, he's got his own ways of thinking or whatever. But the fact of it is that I'm straight opposed to killing people. I don't want the government to have the right to kill me. Yeah. I don't want doctors to have the right to kill me. I think that's a crazy idea. I really do. The concept of creating an exception to manslaughter in your laws, so why am I using the term manslaughter? Because it's a good legal term. Or creating an exception to homicide, or creating an exception to assisting a suicide in law. These are pretty crazy ideas to me. Because you're giving a lot of power to someone over your life and death. And they say, yes, but we're trying to relieve suffering. Well, if you want to relieve suffering, we should be relieving suffering. Like there are ways to relieve suffering. You don't have to kill someone to relieve suffering. Nonetheless, killing people is a very dangerous thing. And I don't think we should ever go there. And we're going there to our own loss. So in my own country, so I'll go back to Canada, we're at about now of 5% of all deaths. So euthanasia now in Canada, about 5%.
Wow.
And that does vary throughout the country. So in 2023, Quebec, which is, Montreal, Quebec City, Quebec is the second largest province in Canada, and it has the highest euthanasia rate now in the world. Okay. So last year it was 7.3% of all deaths. That was last year. This year, I don't know where it's going to end up. I haven't seen enough data to know where they're heading, but it is heading up, sadly. In my own province of Ontario, where I live, we're the biggest province in Canada, it's around 4% of all deaths are now. And British Columbia, which is just north of you, is the second highest in Canada. In last year, it was at 5.5% of all deaths. So it's gone from being the exception to the normal. And that's very concerning. When killing someone is normal,
Mm.
Especially since most people who believe in euthanasia will say, well, I don't think it's always the best idea, but if I were suffering, or if I had this, or if I had that, I could see it as being a possibility. You sort of talked to me earlier about that. You could say, well, in some circumstances, you can really understand this. Well, as a human being, I can always understand in some circumstances, but it's never for the some circumstances.
Hmm.
In my own country, we Canada got rid of the terminal illness requirement, which is the same thing they're trying to do now in the US, get rid of that terminal illness requirement. We got rid of that because they said it created inequality. It was unequal. The law was unequal. And why did they say that? Well, there was a court case that was in Quebec, and it was two people with disabilities who both were not terminally ill, and they said that the law was unequally applied because their natural deaths were not reasonably foreseeable. They were not terminally ill. And therefore, they asked the court to strike down that part of the law, and the court agreed. The court said, yes, you have a condition which is irremediable,
Hmm.
meaning you're not getting better, right? Irremediable. And you have a grievous condition. So therefore, you should also have an opportunity to have someone kill you, because just because you're not terminally ill doesn't mean that you're not going through circumstances which would be defined in the law. It's just that you're not terminal. Now, the problem with that is if you get rid of terminal illness, that's when the whole other questions start coming in. People who have disabilities, often with a chronic condition, a lot of these people live in poverty.
Hmm.
And that's why we've had this serious shift in Canada. I'm not saying that there wasn't a problem before. I'm saying, but after you remove the terminal illness requirement in law, then it expanded horrifically to people with disabilities who are living in poverty.
Hmm.
And this is the kind of thing you get. And then this is where we're at.
I have so many questions, and there's so many aspects of this that are really, that stand out as particularly troubling. One of them is there's such a anti-suicide push in the criminal code. I mean, people can be locked up for 72 hours, I think is the standard hold in Washington state,
Yeah.
for expressing suicidal ideation to the wrong
Right. To
authority.
protect them.
To protect them.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
we're going to use massive amounts of state power and funds to keep people from making these choices for themselves. And yet there's this push for the state to be involved. And if it's okayed by a doctor, even though that seems to be a really dubious administrative process, and especially when you describe the qualifications, the 6-month thing is really easily sidestepped. It's kind of
Correct. Yeah.
it just creates a loophole that people find a way around.
Right.
But why would there be such a dual perspective on suicide? You can't do it yourself, but we can do it to you.
Well, I think that what's happened is because the culture has shifted. You have a lot of what you would say parts of the culture that stop making any sense. So historically, the concept of killing someone was considered absolutely wrong. We just didn't do that. So in the same way, when you looked at someone who was suicidal, you would say, wait a second here. Most suicidal cases are people going through mental health, extreme mental health situations. Therefore, a caring culture will protect you for a period of time. So hopefully you get beyond that point, and then you can start recovering. The funny thing is that you're in Washington State. I'm not sure what city you're in, but that's fine. In Ontario, we have a lot of homelessness now. I'm assuming Washington State and the cities has the same.
A lot. I'm not far from Seattle, and it is really overrun with
We
homelessness.
I live in the city of London, Ontario, and London, Ontario is about 500,000 people or so, a little less than that. But we always had a problem with homelessness, like every major city, but nothing like we have now. We have these massive camp cities,
Yeah.
These tent cities, right, etc. It's a little bit worse where I am in the sense that some parts of Seattle, I guess it could get cold in the winter, but not for many days, a few days maybe, but not for many days. It can get cold here for, a good straight week where it's really cold. You have all these tent cities. Nonetheless, this homelessness problem is related to people having a lot of mental health problems. It's also addiction. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of addiction problems. In the past, we had psychiatric hospitals. And I'm not saying they were wonderful. I'm not saying this was a good thing, because in fact, there's a lot of stories about things that happened. And, obviously human beings being human beings, bad things have happened, and you can't change what's happened in the past. You can only hope that we don't do these kind of things in the future. Nonetheless, somebody in a similar situation going through, a significant psychiatric problem would often be put into a psychiatric facility for a period of time, and they try and help them recover. That was the theory, at least.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we don't have that. We just don't. There is some recovery places. Don't get me wrong. It's not like it doesn't exist at all, but it doesn't exist like it did before. That's certainly the truth. And on top of it, the extreme amount of space we would need today to do the same sort of thing, even if we were actually doing it in the right way, this doesn't exist. So now when you're talking about the issue of suicide, well, we seem to have a higher suicide rate. Suicide's gone up. I know sometimes suicide's accidental, meaning that they'd have a drug overdose and it's seen as a suicide, but it was a drug overdose. And all of these things are tragic. To me, I don't think the answer to the tragic reality of our human experience is to kill people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't see that. But it's becoming the reality. Now, why is it becoming the reality? Well, why should someone who's terminally ill, if they're allowed to die by assisted suicide, why should they have that and someone else who's suffering not have that? You see, the problem is once you legalize it, the whole situation shifts. Now, in the US, you're not quite the same as Canada yet. And the reason is in the US, you have 10 states that have legalized assisted suicide and 40 that have not.
Mm-hmm.
And the assisted suicide lobby, they want it legal everywhere. So they know that if Washington State or California were to change their law and take out the terminal illness requirement and make it just wide open, they know that other states would just not go there. They would say, wait a second here, that's pretty crazy. We're not going to do that. This is too much. So they know that they have to hold the line until they are at the point where they've got a majority of the U.S. population that's legalized it, and they're not there yet. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I'll give you an example. California had a bill that was presented this year in their legislature, and it ended up getting pulled. And it was to change their assisted suicide law, because assisted suicide is also legal in California. It was to change the assisted suicide law by removing that terminal illness requirement, and they wanted to put in the same definition that we have in Canada, that you have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. Leslie, what's a grievous and irremediable medical condition? Can you define that for me?
Pretty darn vague.
I can't define it. The law doesn't define it. Mm-hmm. So you can see how, you can see how someone who's going through homelessness would qualify.
So they
want the same thing in California. All I'm saying to you is that bill got pulled, not because it didn't have a lot of support, but because the assisted suicide lobby said, if you guys do that, then we're not going to be able to legalize it in Maryland, in Connecticut, and all these other states where it's not legal yet, where they want to legalize it.
They have to go slower.
Those states aren't going to go there.
Yeah.
Right. Got to move slower. That's what's going on in the U.S.
Yeah.
Whereas Canada,
the marketing push
everywhere, and they're pushing and pushing and pushing because the goalpost shifted after legalization.
So I want to talk to you about exactly that, the push for expansion of these programs and the marketing aspect of all of this, but also, one of the core issues that I guess when we were talking right before we hit record, and I said, I said, I'm staunchly against this, and then I said, well, I guess I could kind of see some circumstance. So when I went recently, somebody pointed out some of the changes to the Hippocratic Oath. So the original Hippocratic Oath had this clause: I will give no deadly medicine to anyone if asked, nor suggest any such counsel. And so this seems to imply, and also common sense or just the imagination can also picture that probably for all time, people who have been charged with providing palliative care or health care, trying to save people who are suffering from illness or injury, have been faced by cases where the suffering is very great and the doctor or the caregiver has no more options to offer. And they're looking at an individual who is writhing in pain or just suffering, and the end is nigh.
Situation,
so
there are people in pain. and it
Right.
could be extreme pain. But there's no situation where there's nothing they can do. That
Well, and
doesn't exist.
that's what I guess what I'm saying is, like, in my mind, I can see that this is a potential
Right,
circumstance that a
right,
medical provider is involved in. And this is the, I guess this is the picture, the schema that the imagination comes up with when we
right,
talk about assisted suicide or
right,
euthanasia. But in no way does that apply to mental health care, which is not medical,
yeah,
or to homelessness or other social situations, or even to experiences of desperate isolation, fear,
right.
loneliness, all these other things, which are also very, there's human suffering. Life has so much suffering, but I don't see how we have, how have we politically crossed the line between the doctor standing over the writhing uh, physical pain of a person to the guy is homeless and he's really miserable, so maybe we should give him a lethal cocktail. I mean, how do we
Well,
politically justify a doctor being involved in that?
well, we haven't. What happened is that you were describing the circumstance that the assisted suicide lobby promotes. Like
Right.
their story that they will go with in every single state is the person suffering, and
Mhm.
there are real stories. So I'm not going to argue that people don't suffer. Of course, we're human
Yeah.
beings, and I'm not going to dwell on suffering because I know that there's many things we can do for people who are suffering in order to alleviate that suffering. Now, one, for instance, like if someone's in a lot of pain, you can always put them into a sleep. I was talking about how they
Mhm.
kill you by assisted suicide. They use enough drug to put you into coma in order to prevent that person from suffering the effects of the drug they're giving them to kill them, which is actually horrific drugs.
Right.
The poison to
Yeah.
kill you is pretty horrific. So we're going to put you in coma first.
Mhm.
Well, they could do the same thing in palliative care. They call it,
Right.
a palliative sedation. They put you into sedation, and then you're deeply sleeping, and then of course you're not in that deep pain. Now, even and the funny thing is the argument of the euthanasia lobby is, well, sometimes the sedation isn't deep enough. Um, well, that could be the case that the doctor didn't effectively sedate the person deep enough. I get that. That could happen. These are all possibilities within the realm of the. But should you kill them now because of that? The secondly, I'm arguing the same thing with the suicide, which is
Right.
horrific death. Oh, because there's a good chance that they weren't deep enough into
By
coma.
your own
That
logic.
yeah. Therefore, they're also going to be suffering horrifically, but they just can't show it to you because they're laying there and they could be what I'm getting to. Anyway, so let's get
Mhm.
back to it. So what's happened is they've sold it. The selling of assisted suicide came with the hard case. And as you know, we always said historically, hard cases make bad laws. So you have this terrible situation. So what we're going to do is we're going to totally change the law based on this one terrible situation that happened. And in fact, laws should be able to apply widely in a humane manner that we all recognize that's how we have justice within our culture. It applies to all of us equally. It's another problem with assisted suicide euthanasia because the law doesn't now apply to all of us equally. So before you legalize assisted suicide or euthanasia, I'm not allowed to kill you. I'm just not allowed to kill you. But once you legalize this, the doctor can kill you. The law says the doctor can kill you, so long as you had requested it. Yes, and there's many reasons you might request it. You might be so depressed and alone that you want to die. There's lots of people want to die. Is the answer
Right.
to people who want to die that we kill them? This is the reality, right? So you've changed the law, and now it's unequal. So now someone actually has the right and law to kill you or to be involved with killing you. So we have lost our equality. It's not about equality anymore, and it's not about equal protection either. The other point comes down to the whole thing does it start this way? Where does it end? Well, the point of it is once you allow it, I said the goalposts have to move. Now, why do they have to move? Well, because, and I've written a lot about this. You can find my articles. I've written an awful lot about this. The assisted suicide lobby knows it's much harder to legalize assisted suicide in a state than it is to expand it in the state once legalized. So you look at them, almost every state now that's legalized assisted suicide
Mhm.
has also expanded their law,
It's a
right?
classic sales tactic.
So yeah, so they say, well, we're going to keep it really tight. So you look at New York, where they've been debating assisted suicide, and once again, this is another year where it didn't pass. I'm very thankful because New York's a massive state, and it hasn't passed there yet. But they do the same thing. They're trying to sell you the minutia of the law. They're trying to say, well, this is only for these circumstances, and that seems, reasonable because none of us as human beings want to go through that.
Mhm.
I don't want to suffer. I don't want you to suffer either. I've got no interest in you suffering. But I don't think we should be killing you either.
Hmm.
right? I don't think that's a safe way to respond to this
Hmm.
situation
Hmm.
at all whatsoever. Nonetheless, that's how they sell it. And then once it's sold, well, then the next question is, well, they always usually have, like, for instance, the original law you had a 15-day waiting period in the assisted suicide law in Washington State. Then they amended that. So
Hmm.
now it doesn't have a 15-day waiting period. So what they say is they say, well, we recognize that there's a lot of people who change their mind after a few days of reflection. So they put the reflection period in to say that gives an opportunity to make sure that people aren't dying by assisted suicide who otherwise were just having a really bad day, type thing.
Hmm. Hmm.
But then they get rid of that because then they say, oh, that's discrimination. Because now it's denying someone who is suffering an opportunity to die quickly,
This is
to get
the
away from suffering.
argument that just, it's so maddening to hear this discrimination argument. Discrimination.
Right.
Who is lobbying to kill whom in these cases? Who is behind these pushes to end the discrimination against the mentally ill that want to
Right.
die? Who's lobbying to kill these people?
Well, it's always see, it's the assisted suicide
It
lobby in
sounds
Canada, the euthanasia law.
astroturfed.
They're involved in that. So let's say you're running Compassionate Choices. Obviously, Compassionate Choices, which is the
Right.
major group in the U.S.
Okay.
They're not the only
Compassion and
group, but they're
choice. Okay.
yeah, that's their name, Compassionate Choice. It's a good name.
Okay.
Compassionate Choices is a good name, because we all want compassion, we all want choices. So it's a great name.
Yeah.
It's just not really what they stand for. It is about killing, okay?
Yeah.
That's what it's about. Nonetheless, they have a lot of supporters. So obviously, in Washington State, if they wanted to amend your law, what they would do is they would find one of their supporters who's going through a difficult circumstance, and then they would be the story behind this is
Yeah.
why we need to get rid of the terminal illness requirement
Right.
because
So they
because
use
Judy,
people.
yeah, because Judy has this type of a disability
Mhm.
and she's been going through this type of a circumstance, which usually is not more about medical abandonment than freedom.
Mm.
She's not being treated properly. Nonetheless, that's the story they'll bring forward. So, for instance, I mentioned in Canada, we got rid of the terminal illness requirement because of a court case. They had two people with disabilities in Quebec. Now, let's be brutally honest. Both of those people were living in um, institutions. Both of them, when challenged by the disability movement in Canada, because in Canada, the disability movement is pretty universally opposed to euthanasia. They were quite upset that these two people were asking the court to remove the terminal illness requirement because they didn't qualify. And they both said the same thing. Well, if I could live in an apartment, if I could live on my own, if there was funding for that, then I would be happy to stay alive. But I don't like being institutionalized. So
Wow.
start thinking about this. So because you haven't properly cared for these people, like, I'm not hiding anything. I don't want to be institutionalized. I wouldn't want. If I had a disability, I would want the ability, whether that be through the insurance company or whether that be through some government help or friends and family, to enable me to continue to live my life in my home and in my community. Because obviously that's where I thrive. Those are the people I know. I'm a I'm a human being, right? I need friends around me. I don't need just some nurse who brings me my plate of food and says, there you are. I need family around me. I need people. We all need that because we're all human. You know what I'm getting to? So the law expands by these hard cases, and this is what's been going on. Nearly every state has expanded their laws. Some of them haven't yet. I
Mhm.
mentioned that because New Mexico legalized assisted suicide a few years ago, but theirs is the most extreme assisted suicide law in the US. So they have not amended their law yet. But from the very beginning, they allowed nurse practitioners to be involved. From the very beginning, they didn't have a waiting period. From the very beginning, it was such a
Oh,
wide
wow.
law to
Yeah.
start with that, you know, the only thing missing was euthanasia.
Wow.
I'm going to say something else because I know we're almost to the hour point. When
Sure.
you have assisted suicide, you actually also have euthanasia. Now, why is that? There are some circumstances that would be very hard for someone to self ingest these horrible, horrific
Mhm.
concoctions, these poisons. It's very hard to do so. So let's say you had a medical condition, and this is horrible stuff to have to take. I mean, it's there might be a time where someone might have to do it to you. Now, who would know different? I already told you the doctors were already there. They approved it for lethal drugs. Well, the lethal drugs work whether you take it yourself or someone gives it to you. They work. They will kill you. So at some point, you realize, well, there's no witness at the point of death. Like, it's not like the law says, okay, we've approved assisted suicide in Washington State. So therefore, before you take the lethal poison, there must be a neutral witness there so we can make sure that the law is followed. That doesn't exist. Nothing in the law like that either. So obviously speaking, when you have assisted suicide, you will also have euthanasia because there's nothing preventing it. Nothing in the law preventing it. Okay. And the other thing is, even if the doctor were present, is the doctor going to self-report that they actually did the act rather than just making sure the person's self-ingested?
Right.
Would they self-report that? Would they go to the authorities and say that? Because remember, Kevorkian got away with it over and over and over again. You might remember that. And then when he, on television, actually injected Thomas Yoke, so that was euthanasia. That's when he was convicted of murder, because that's what he did. He murdered him, and he did so in Michigan, and he ended up going to jail for that. But all those assisted suicide cases, he seemed to be able to get off for different reasons, but he didn't get it. So, obviously a doctor's not going to self-admit this because they're going to say, I don't know if I want to go to jail, And this is the kind of thing that's the reality. So I'm just telling you that people say, oh, well, it's assisted suicide. It's about my body, my choice. No. It is about the doctor being involved with killing you. But it's also about opening the door to a law that allows somebody to be directly involved with killing you. And you can't control that unless the law would prescribe that, and it doesn't. It doesn't.
So then the difference between assisted suicide and euthanasia really starts to disappear.
Absolutely, yeah. Because the only real difference is who does the act. And there is no third-party authority to ensure that the law is being followed. It seems
like, when you're talking about the potential for palliative care, even the very sleep or coma that they would use if they were to medically or administratively kill you, the fact that even if you're suffering very badly, that's an available option for palliative care. It seems like the real benefit of euthanasia or assisted suicide is the relief of the burden to the people around you that don't have to watch you suffer. And so there's a couple of things. If you have just a few more minutes, the marketing aspect. So when you were talking with Jonathan, you spoke about how these care teams in the hospitals actually sell these services to the patient. And if I can put myself in the position of someone who is suffering very badly and watching my family also just devastated, and somebody's saying to me, you can make this easier on them. You can let them start getting on with the rest of their life. There
is another way,
Yeah.
We can get this done,
and take quickly. And this will be the kindest option for your family so that they can grieve and move on, so they don't have to watch you in here.
But let me differentiate the things a little bit. So in Canada, because it's become dealt with as a healthcare, even though it's not healthcare, they're doing the same thing in the US. I have to be honest, it is also happening the same way in the US about defining it as healthcare, where there's nothing healthcare-ish about it. It is about killing. But anyway, because of that, and because of this other issue in Canada, which is that there's a lot of doctors who want nothing to do with it. Okay. So you have a situation where you've legalized euthanasia, and you've got an awful lot of doctors who say, I don't want anything to do with this. This is not what I went to medical school for. I'm not going to get involved with approving and prescribing or lethally injecting. I'm not going to do this. Okay. So what they did is, in every major hospital in Canada, they now have a MAID team. Now, MAID is the term they came up with in Canada to make you feel better about killing. I love for the Dutch euthanasia law, but at least the Dutch are honest. The Dutch, every time you see the reports and you read the stuff about coming out of the Netherlands, it always says euthanasia. They do refer to it as killing. They're not afraid to call it killing. Whereas in Canada, oh no, it's not.
It's got to be a euphemism.
What is it? Okay, what is it then? If it's not killing, tell me what it is. Anyway,
the
Dutch are at least honest. So they have these MAID teams, these euthanasia teams, and they not only then will do the act, they also sell the act. So they go from door to door in the hospital asking people, did you know that MAID was an option? Did you know that euthanasia is an option for you? And I get calls like this now all the time from our supporters. They're just upset. I got a call from a woman in British Columbia, and she was an elderly woman. Her husband was in palliative care, and the MAID team came in and asked him for euthanasia, and they said, no, we're not interested in euthanasia. They had no interest. This is a couple who didn't believe in killing people. They were wanted to die a natural. Her husband was wanting to die a natural death. Okay. I guess it's not really about choice because the mate team came back again. So she calls me up. She says, they've asked us 5 times now.
Oh my gosh.
Let's start thinking about what it means.
That's harassment.
It is harassment. That's exactly it. So let's think about what it means to be human. We're all human beings. You're going through a difficult time in your life. Even if you're a person of faith, so you're thinking, well, I know my time is coming, but I'm going to have everlasting life once I pass through this human life into eternal life. Even if you're have that belief, you're still going through a tough time. Let's be brutally honest. And then they keep asking you, oh, do you want May? Do you want euthanasia? It becomes a situation where some people start thinking, well, maybe I should be wanting euthanasia. This guy called me from Ottawa, and I think this is the story I gave Jonathan also, which is exactly, he calls me up. He's all upset because he says, we're visiting my dad. He's in palliative care. The whole family's together. And the May team came in, and they asked my dad if he wanted euthanasia, and he said no. Well, you think that'd be done, right? He said no. Okay. But they were visiting, and then they all went down for a coffee. They come back, and what does the dad say? Well, guess what happened when you guys all left? The maid team came back and asked me again. So they were thinking, oh, the only reason Mr. So-and-so said no to us was because the family was around.
Let's get him alone.
Let's get him alone and ask him again. This is harassment.
Yes, it
is.
And
then people start asking the question, why is Canada such a high euthanasia rate? We legalized in 2016. The Netherlands legalized in 2002. And yet our euthanasia rate is now rivaling the Netherlands numbers. And you'd say, how did that happen so fast? How come we got so normalized the killing? It's because of how we institutionalized killing.
Right.
We've accepted the killing. So it's a little bit different in Washington State. So in Washington State, you've got a thing called End of Life Washington, I believe is the group. It's the Compassion Choices derivative in your state. Okay. Most of the assisted suicides are done by them. So what happens is if someone is seeking assisted suicide or interested, or if a doctor's pro-assisted suicide, they're usually connected to them. And so let's also talk about this whole thing about choice and freedom and everything. What happens is, let's say you're in Washington State and you talk to your doctor, and let's say you're going through a really terrible time and you ask the question about assisted suicide. That doesn't necessarily mean you want assisted suicide. That just means you know it's a legal option and you're just thinking about it. They will then refer you to End of Life Washington. End of Life Washington will then set you up with an assisted suicide doctor. Now you think, oh, but it takes 2 to approve you. But all of these doctors work with the same people.
Work together.
So if Dr. X approves your death, he's not going to send you to some person some doctor who's opposed to assisted suicide. They're going to send you to Dr. Y every time. So all of these reports that are approved by Dr. X are also signed off by Dr. Y.
Yeah.
Well, is that making sure that you're covered? What if you're going through a lot of mental angst? Is there anything new about that in the human reality? The answer is nothing new about that. The difference is that they don't seem to care about that, even though the law says that, like in Washington State and Oregon, etc., the law says that if there's signs of you going through, mental health questions, depression, etc., you're to be sent for a psychiatric assessment. There's almost no assessments done every year. Look at the data, almost none. So obviously speaking, they don't care about that. They're not worried about that. All they're worried about is, oh, so-and-so has a terminal condition. We can assess that as likely less than 6 months. We can approve you, and off we go. I'm going to say something else about your data. Yeah. Every year in Oregon, Washington State, California, if you look at the data, it shows you there's X number of assisted suicide deaths. So as an example, in 2023, I don't have the Washington data in front of me, but I know the Oregon data well. They had 367 reported assisted suicide deaths in 2023. And then it says there was 101 people who were approved for assisted suicide, who received the lethal drugs, but they don't know what happened to them. Every year you have this type of number in there. In California last year, it was 200 something. Like I don't have the number from my face.
That's that's a huge percentage of their.
That's a massive percentage.
Data.
So now what? Yeah. So we know that some of those people were people who died by assisted suicide, but the report wasn't received yet. Because there's some doctors who send in a late report. So what's going to happen is when the 2024 data comes out, they're going to correct the 2023 data. That happens every year. So in the 2023 report, if you look at the 2022 data, it was corrected from that 2022 report because they had some late reports. So there's some of that in that 101 number, okay? But there's some people, they just don't know what happened to them at all. They know they received lethal drugs. They know they're approved and they received them. And they know they died. They just don't know how they died. And there's nothing in the system. If you look at Oregon, Washington State, California, none of those laws have given the power to the health authority to investigate. So is there a chance that there's a certain percentage every year of deaths which are just not reported? And the answer is could be. Can I prove it? There's no way to prove it. And because this is dealing with healthcare questions, it's all under privacy. So unless the government would actually be willing to do the proper investigation, we have no idea. Now, what happens to the people who actually died a natural death? Because some people received the lethal dose, and maybe 5 days later, they just died in the night. They died a natural death. They had a terminal condition, they died. Now, what was uncommon about that? It wasn't. What happens to the lethal drugs? Do you know what happens? I don't know what happens to them. The government doesn't know what happens to them. So you have these lethal drugs that have been prescribed, that were picked up, that were
not very well regulated.
Maybe beside the bedside. Maybe they're sitting in the bathroom and the person dies. What happened to those lethal drugs? Remember, these are lethal drugs. This is lethal poison. They don't know what happened. Think about it. And then this is about life and death, and we're supposed to feel comfortable with this. So there's really more questions than answers with this, to tell you the truth.
And one of the things that
it is
really
about killing.
Worries me about this is you mentioned the institutionalization of it, how this has become so much more accepted in Canada. And we've had such an institutionalization of other aspects of people's health and life processes, like I think of childbirth and the pregnancy process, how very institutionalized and medicalized that has become to the detriment of many outcomes, healthcare outcomes. And I can imagine a time when it's really, really common for people to just choose to end their life this way, to medically, administratively, like with pets, the cat is getting old. She's not getting around as well. It's time to schedule that appointment. I mean, when are we going to start doing that with mom?
It is terrifying. A big concern, especially since, and as you would know, and I would know, a cat is not mom.
Right.
As much as a cat is someone, like I have a dog. I love my dog. She's a beautiful dog. She's 14. Well, 14 soon. And it gets difficult. And I love my dog. But my dog is not my mom.
Yeah.
As much as I love my dog. Okay? They're just not the same. They have a totally different ability to communicate with me. They're totally different in the value level. And also, should a society ever get involved with killing people? This is the serious thing. Where does it go?
Can you tell me the coffee case? The coffee in the Netherlands?
Okay, so that was the case that changed things in the Netherlands for euthanasia for mental illness. So what you had is a case, they already allowed euthanasia for mental illness in the Netherlands. So you had the situation where a woman, she wasn't actually mentally ill, she had dementia and she had requested euthanasia. And so what happened is that it was scheduled and the family was there. And it doesn't matter. It was a female doctor. The woman came. She was, and the woman who was scheduled to die said no. She was resisting. No. So they put the sedative in her coffee because they wanted to sedate her. Now this is supposed to be
so they could bypass her resistance
because she was resisting. But the problem was she continued to resist, even though they sedated her. She continued to resist. She continued to say no. So the doctor had the family hold her down as she injected her. And then the woman died. Well, someone sent in a complaint about this. They were upset. They were very upset about this. How could this family have held her down? How could the doctor put put sedative in her coffee first and then kill her when she was saying no? Now, at first, the doctor lost her license and was sort of prosecuted, but she wasn't going to jail or anything like that. And this is the right problem. Once you've legalized killing, the goalpost is shifted. So this is like an error in the killing
instead
rather
of homicide.
Than being a homicide, right? It ended up at the Supreme Court of the Netherlands, and then in the Supreme Court decision, which was insane, they said it was okay because the woman had dementia, therefore She had previously requested euthanasia. Therefore, she was incapable of changing her mind. Therefore, it was okay what they did. So even though she was saying no and she was physically resisting, even though, but because she had dementia. Now, here's the problem with all of this. This is supposed to be about choice and autonomy. And what this doctor did is kill her. And the family assisted in the killing. So at what point is choice and autonomy just the flag we wave to sell something? And the reality is this is about killing. Because that's what happened in that case. And sadly, our Canadian law, if you listen to the interview with Jonathan, our Canadian law is actually worse than your American assisted suicide laws because it says that the doctor only has to be of the opinion. So the doctor who gets to inject you or does it by, they hook you up with an IV line and they put it through there. That's the other way they do it. It's an IV line. The doctor who kills you only has to be of the opinion you fit the criteria of the law. Now, what does that mean? Even in a case where a family might be totally upset saying this doesn't make any sense. How did this get approved that they killed mom? Mom might have been 87, but mom was pretty good. She might have, these days where but mom was pretty good, How could they have approved this killing? It doesn't matter. Like there's all these cases, like the Duncan case. You might have heard about the Duncan case. You can Google that case. So you have the case in British Columbia of the Duncan sisters were very upset that their mother got killed by euthanasia. They just couldn't figure it out. Their mother had an accident, a car accident, and had a head injury. This happened just before COVID. And then during COVID, COVID hit. And so their mother was not getting treatment for her head injury. So she was dizzy. She was having problems. She received no treatment whatsoever. She was then approved for euthanasia, and they killed her. Her name was Donna Duncan, the one who died.
Oh, my God.
You can Google Donna Duncan. And the family, the daughters are just so beside themselves. They put in a complaint. The police agreed that this is a serious problem. How did Donna get approved to be killed? So the police did an investigation and came back and said, no law was broken. Well, I knew that the way the law is written, it's impossible to prosecute a doctor who did something so horrific as killing mom when mom really needed treatment. So we're getting near the end of this. I'm just going to say to you, there are some big differences in different jurisdictions. And not that there's anything good ever about killing, because I don't believe there's anything good about killing. I don't think it's a safe society. I don't feel safe in a society when a doctor can kill me. You live in Washington State. I would far rather live in Mississippi where the doctors can't kill you. Because we all go through terrible times in our life. And I already said earlier, there's lots of reasons I might feel that my life lacks meaning, purpose, or value, that I want to die. That's because I'm a human being. Let's be brutally honest and look at the reality of living. And we all go through different times of our life. And so now you're going to say, oh, if you're going through that situation, doctor can kill you. And I'm supposed to feel safe with that. I don't feel safe with that. The law should protect me, even from me at a time in my life where I'm going through a very difficult time. The law should protect me. And of course, when we're looking at the situation of all these people living in the streets and the difficulty going on, it seems to me that we're slowly moving to the point, because we're not helping these people. And I believe we should be helping these people. I'm absolutely convinced there's only one answer to this. It's not giving them free drugs. That's not the answer. It's not, finding them a nicer tent, finding them a place to live. Yeah, that would be an answer. The answer is actually trying to help them through their mental health crisis, through their addiction crisis, so they can actually be freed of the slavery they're living. Because it is a type of slavery they're living. And they're human beings. But in the end, if we don't do that, sorry, if you've allowed assisted suicide, you've allowed euthanasia, I'm being brutally sad and straightforward with you. Some of the answer in the future is going to be that some of these people qualify. Some of these people qualify. And the other thing is, well, who would know different anyway? Yeah, there's a few people on the street who know them, but who would know different anyway? They've become incidentals in our world. So it's really problematic, really a problematic concept when you start giving the right in law to somebody else to kill you. You should never go there. You just shouldn't go there. And we're gone there. Yeah. We've gone there. And It's absolutely terrible to me that we've gone there.
Extremely disturbing, extremely worrisome. And
So if anybody wants to contact
yeah.
me, I'm easy to contact. I can be emailed at info@epcc.ca, epcc.ca. Sorry about the .ca, that's Canadian. EPCC is Euthanasia Prevention Coalition Canada. You can blog me. I've got the largest source of information on these topics in the world. I've been blogging this topic since 2007, and so I have the largest source of information. You can go to the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition website, and then you hit the blog. We also have an EPC USA, so EPC USA exists, and so we're involved in the US. But let's not be innocent about this. It's never a good idea to give someone the right amount to be involved with killing him. It just doesn't make any sense. You're a human being.
Absolutely.
We can talk about choice, freedom, and autonomy all we want, but when does it become choice, freedom, and autonomy when somebody else is involved with poisoning you to death? It just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. So,
Alex, thank you so much for sharing your time with me today. And I'll put the links that you just gave in the description of this video if people want to click on those links and contact you and get involved, because this is going to be everywhere. I can just see this is creeping in. Like you said, it starts with something that's a very limited scope, and then once it gets in, it expands. And I think that we're going to be looking at a giant wave of this coming through the US soon. And
we can prevent that. But I mean, it takes the reality that people have to say, I don't want someone to be able to kill me.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Alex. Thank you so much for your time. And it's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you.